The rise of Broadway musicals in Hollywood weakened vaudeville's business and eventually killed it. But its methods and practices and the lessons we learned from its live event management, contracting, promotion, sales, programming, etc., remain deeply embedded in the entertainment business and continue to influence it until this very day. It wasn't until 1960s that we would see another live music industry surge that could compare in size and scope to vaudeville itself. But this time it would continually and progressively lead to today's lay of the land in the field. Enter Rock and Roll 2.2, made in England. The American rock and roll music crossed the ocean on the radio waves and on the record grooves and entered the British youth culture in the mid to late 1950s. And pretty soon the Brits were not only listening and dancing to it, but were also making it themselves at the time when the interest for the original form of the genre slowly waned back in the States and a more pop version of it watered it down. But in Britain, the bands in the cities like Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, and London kept the fire of this American music phenomenon going with its original intensity and eventually made it their own. Ballrooms, halls, and clubs across Britain were jumping with a new beat, new sound, and new attitude, and rock and roll became the soundtrack of the teenage generation there. This newly found music intensity and freedom could not stay contained on the British Isles, and it crossed the ocean back to the United States with a bang. I Want to Hold Your Hand by the Beatles topped the US charts in January of 1964, and the following month the Beatles themselves arrived to America. On February 9, 1964, 73 million people watched them perform on the Ed Sullivan Show in New York City, the largest audience ever for any television program of the time. 2 days later, they played their first American live venue, Washington Coliseum in Washington, D.C., and then they were back in New York for 2 more shows at Carnegie Hall before going back to England. The Beatlemania and the subsequent British invasion has begun. By April 1964, the Beatles held 12 positions on the Billboard's Hot 100 singles chart, including the top 5. I Want to Hold Your Hand sold 5 million copies of the singles records in the 7 months following its introduction on the charts. In August of the same year, the Beatles returned to the States for a 32-show tour in 34 days across the country. Each show was attended by 10 to 20,000 fans. A year later, they came back for a 10-show tour, this time performing only the stadiums and arenas. The New York City Shea Stadium show was attended by the record 55,600 fans, with thousands more who were turned away for the lack of available seating. They would return for one more tour in 1966, when they performed another 14 stadium and arena shows before deciding to stop performing live altogether. Now, for the live music industry, the lessons of those few years were manifold. One was that the new generations, from teenagers to 20-somethings, were so passionate about their music that given the right artists and opportunities, they will spare no resource and effort to gather with their like-minded peers to hear it live. That it wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was a statement, a declaration, a decision, an affirmation, a deliberate seeking of the place where music would make them feel understood and a part of something entirely their own. Just 3 years after the Beatles' last American show at Candlestick Park in San Francisco, we had Woodstock, where 32 acts performed for an audience of 400,000 fans. Though the festival lost money due to inexperience and a myriad of unforeseen circumstances, not the least one of which was the sheer number of masses who traveled upstate New York to attend, Woodstock showed that the live music industry potential is much greater than we could even imagine to that point. The other lesson the industry learned from the Beatles' US tours was that rock and roll is loud, but that its fans are louder, and that the whole PA thing had to be revisited and revised from the ground up. See, at their first live venue show in the States at Washington Coliseum, the Beatles had to move their amps and drums around the stage throughout the show, facing different sections of the Coliseum so the audience in those sections could hear what they were playing over the screams and shouts of the fans. When they returned to the US the following year, the custom-made amps that were made by Vox for their tour, with the intention to boost their sound to unprecedented levels by the standards of the time, proved to be greatly insufficient again and were dwarfed by the screaming of over 50,000 fans at the Beatles' Shea Stadium show. Not even the Beatles themselves could hear each other play at their Shea Stadium performance, not to mention the audience. The custom amps were made to produce 100 watts of power each, with the reasoning that at more than 3 times the power of the Beatles' regular 30 watts amps, that will be more than adequate. Well, wrong. Try 1,000 watts each, 2,000 watts each, 5,000 watts each, and that's just for the guitar amps. Try a 100,000 watt sound system for a stadium show like that. Now, that was hard to imagine at the time, but we got there, learning from the mistakes and the struggles of those that first carved the path. Another lesson for the live music industry from this time was that the vaudeville's model of opening acts and warm-up groups prior to main acts performance still worked and still served multiple purposes well. Though the main act's performance would throughout the years be greatly prolonged from the Beatles' customary 30 minutes, the practice of introducing and breaking in new artists or warming up the audience, through the use of opening acts persists in the industry to this very day. The Righteous Brothers, the Ronettes, Jackie DeShannon, the Exciters, Tommy Roe, the Remains were all Beatles opening acts on their American shows. Today, like then in the 60s, following the vaudeville's formula from over 100 years ago, virtually every up-and-coming act goes through the rite of passage of being an opening act. And how about the financial end? How were the tickets priced? How much did the Beatles charge? What was the bottom line and the lesson there? Well, the concert promoters of the time were already used to music stars like Frank Sinatra and Judy Garland charging the performance fees of $10,000 to $15,000, which is $75,000 to $110,000 in today's money. Now, that made the live music business at that level a high-stakes game even then. The losses could be just as devastating as the wins were staggering. But the Beatles, led by their manager Brian Epstein, pushed it to an entirely different level. See, the guaranteed performance fees for their first full American tour in 1964 were $25,000 to $40,000, depending on the size of the venue, which is $150,000 to $300,000 in today's value, plus a percentage of the tickets sold, if more than the guaranteed amount. And that's if the promoter was working in the city that was on the planned route, and if he was fortunate or reputable enough in the industry to be approved or asked to do it by Epstein himself. If not, the sky was the limit so far as the fees go. Now, Charles O. Finney, at the time the owner of the Kansas City Athletics, a professional baseball team, and the person who would eventually move the team to Oakland, where they became the famous Oakland A's, decided in 1964 that having the Beatles perform at a baseball stadium in Kansas City as part of their American tour would be great for his baseball business. Unfortunately, Kansas City was not on the list of the tour cities, and Charlie O, as Finney was often called, was not in the live music business at all, and thus not on the Epstein's radar. His trip to San Francisco to meet Epstein after their first tour show there ended with Epstein refusing the offer of $100,000 for the Kansas City performance, an unheard of amount of money for one performance at the time, about $750,000 in today's value. But Charlie O was not deterred. A week later, while the Beatles were in LA, Charlie O wrote Epstein a check for a staggering $150,000 or $1.1 million today, and Epstein just couldn't refuse. On September 17, 1964, on their originally scheduled day off, the Beatles performed at the Municipal Stadium in Kansas City. On the back of every ticket, Charlie O printed, "Today's Beatles fans are tomorrow's baseball fans," making it one of the early cross-promotion attempts that would eventually become the standard practice in the industry.